cutback on opium. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Okay,
And
we're
it's
going
targeting
now.
People, like, because I don't ever take a painkiller, I mean, so it's hard for me to understand, but, you know,
Yeah.
if you were in pain, you want something,
Yeah.
and you know, like Medicare
It's
patients
going.
and seniors are really hurting on this cutback.
It's
So
ridiculous,
They're,
yeah.
they're really hitting the doctors,
Well, they treat like every patient like they're
the
med
same,
CD.
that's exactly right.
And-
And my dentist has severe rotator cuff, and the doctor said, well, you're not being addicted, you really have true pain
Yeah.
and things like that, so it is too bad. It really is.
Yeah, I was kind of sorry they did the operation after 3 years of morphine. I was kind of used to it. So anyway, you asked the question about how that happened with the resident scholar. It started a way long time ago. And when I first came to school here, they used to have these signs that said impeach Earl Warren and get the U.S. out of the red UN. And Boulder was dry and ultra conservative. And there were a lot of nuclear scientists here and a lot of counterintelligence people here to make sure the nuclear scientists didn't fly off to Russia and all this kind of stuff. And there was a guy that made porcelain nose cones for the defense industry named Joseph Coors.
Yeah.
And Joseph Coors decided to run for the Board of Regents. But before he ran for the Board of Regents, he gave a lot of money to people. And they came out with this publication, high glossy thing called New Conservative. And that was to put Paul Danish out of business, who was running the Colorado Daily. Well, they didn't quite accomplish that, but they put up a good fight. So, Coors runs for the Board of Regents, and his platform was he's going to kick all the commies off campus. Now, at that time, there's a guy named Rozek, who later ran for Regents. He was ultra conservative. And there's a guy named Alex Garber, who was a friend of mine. He was the faculty sponsor for the Young People's Socialist League. And they had this ongoing debate, and Garber used to call Rozek a fascist, and Rozek used to call Garber a communist. And they'd hit the news every once in a while. And meanwhile, I was a union president and catching a lot of flack from everybody. But that's where this started. And at that time, I took a few years off to go to law school. And when I came back, these guys were still at it. They set up a thing called the Teller Institute for Science, Technology, and Political Thought,
Right.
funded and sponsored by Teller.
Yeah.
So now we had Oppenheimer's, we had Teller, we had the Operation Blue Book guy, Condon, and a few other people like that. Because what most people don't know is this city was used, the Bureau of Standards, which is now NIST, covered the whole personnel files for the whole Manhattan Project, including TVA. You think of that, and they ran through all this, and it was supposed to be studying weights and measures and standardizing,
Right.
and they had a few 100,000 scientists, etc., making a hydrogen bomb. So when people talk about hiding things in securities, conspiracy theory, if they can hide something like that through the Bureau of Standards, imagine what they can do nowadays. Because they weren't even sophisticated then; they were just plain liars. They took Hitler and Speer and all those propaganda guys to really hone it down to a fine science. So there's been this battle going on, and it's they set up, Coors set up this thing called the American Independence Institute out of Golden, and he and the Cooks and a few other people have been funding a lot of these causes. His biggest thing was the group of state legislators, I forget what the hell their initials were, but that was to draft and lobby for right-wing legislation with all the legislatures in the country. So this has been going on since at least the 50s. It started here with Eisenhower when they were going to make this the wartime capital of the world, or the United States. And then they built Cheyenne Mountain, and at one time the Air Force Academy was here until they moved it to Colorado Springs. Big science and technology thing. They were a big contractor, defense contractor. So we get El Duce in. What the fuck's his, what's his name?
Stefano or,
Yeah, DeStefano.
and Benson.
Oh, Stefano.
Stefano and.
DeStefano.
Stefano.
I mean, this guy,
He's had a couple DUIs.
I had a shoe shine boy in one of the barber shops I worked at that was brighter than DeStefano. And this guy came out of Ridge Home.
Now we're getting into the good stuff.
They think gold is too liberal.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, CU.
Now, here's an aside. My father specifically forbade me to even apply at CU because he was afraid it'd turn me into a commie.
But you did anyhow.
Yeah.
And
Little do you know.
and his thing is if MUU was good enough for he and his brother, it should be good enough for me, and I shouldn't be pretentious and all that. And my brother went to CSU, and Major General Walker, who they just fired from where was it, NATO, for indoctrinating troops. They moved him to Colorado State to teach the ROTC thing. Now, it goes on a little bit more, and they're putting all this money in here, going after, well, they fired a lot of non-tenured teachers. They wouldn't give them tenure. Anybody connected with the American Federation of Teachers, they got rid of the year that Coors went on to become regent. And then they've been trying to privatize University of Colorado since then. Now, before Coors went on, what?
They're going to privatize what?
University of Colorado.
Oh.
So they, when Benson came in, it really escalated because he had all these rich oil people, and so that's how long this whole thing's been going. And I've sociogrammed it with Reverend Moon and the Moonies, and they are all linked together. The World Anti-Communist League, and a lot of it was headquartered out of here. You don't believe me, do you?
So why was there such a focus on Colorado in the 50s relative to like Cheyenne Mountain and the Air Force Academy? And
Because
you made some comment about it being, it's like
we
everything
had-
else gets blown up. What's one?
We still have, I found out today, we still have a nuclear site here in Colorado.
there's a bunch of them.
That explain.
So what happened is,
Some power broker that sort of,
no, General Eisenhower ran for president and got elected. And his wife, Mimi, was from Denver. And at that time, you didn't have guided missiles. You had ballistic missiles. And a ballistic missile, you throw something in the air and hope it lands where you want it to land.
It sounds effective.
And the
I've
ballistic
learned a lot
missiles
about ballistic missiles.
couldn't get much beyond the east or west coast
got it.
or the northern boundaries. So they put the DEW line up on the northern boundaries, and then they hollowed out Cheyenne Mountain. And in fact, my next door neighbor growing up, he was the one that designed and put the springs on all the buildings down there. They hollowed out Cheyenne Mountain so you could then bomb it directly and nothing happened. And started duplicating things here in Colorado
But why? That's what he's asking. Why?
So-
somewhere else?
because they couldn't get there.
Because it's in the center of the country.
And they needed to have, like Weather Mountain and a few things like that you've probably read about. They needed a wartime basis of operation.
Command center.
And this was actually the whole thing with Dr. Strangelove alluded to some of this. And I remember growing up, we had duck and cover atomic bomb blast things, and we had nerve gas drills because nerve gas was manufactured where DIA is now,
Oh, that's what was that place called?
Rocky Mountain Arsenal.
That's right.
And they used to put their waste projects or their waste stuff down the well. They dug wells there and they put it down there and lubricated the fault line. So about 1967 or so, we started having earthquakes around here, and they were lubricating the fault line, but they stopped that. So anyway, that's how it sort of evolved. And if you look at various directories, let it go. It's, you've got places like Colorado Springs, Aspen, etc. A lot of 2, 3-star generals and admirals, and it's a lot of military people. The Federal Center used to be Remington Arms Company before World War II, or during World War II, and 70% of that is underground. So who knows what's under there now. Now here's another curious thing to think about. In my career, I've defended a few U-2 pilots and a 1 U-1 pilot. Every one of them was trained as a geologist. So we're drinking one night. I do that occasionally. And talking to this one, he ended up as a judge up in Leadville. And so for some reason, he was stupid enough to hire me to defend him on some stuff. Anyway, I was asking about this geology stuff. And, you know, what happened with powers and all this kind of, because it's a big rumor within the clandestine community. And he said, because in the days of the ballistic missile, you had to determine where the missile was going when you shut off the juice. So you had to mathematically project a trajectory.
Right.
And different substances in the earth affected the trajectory. And if it flew over iron, you would have a different gravitational force than flying over sodium. And they had all of this mapped out with the U-2s. So we could hit the target. And then they got the ballistic, they got the ICBMs and all that kind of stuff.
So the U-2 pilots were mapping the geological
Mostly, yeah.
characteristics of the...
Yeah, but they said we're
of
trying to
Russia.
find Russian bases. Well, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
They want to know
That's
Russian
so
geology.
weird. Talk about minutia.
Huh?
That's so deep in the weeds.
Yeah.
Very powers as a U-2 got shot down in Russia.
Dude, I didn't know that.
1960.
Well, there's some other interesting facts here, like if you look at the structure of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, each state has its own, what do they call it? Special Agent in Charge, SAC. So there's 50 states, there's 50 SACs, except for Wyoming got left out. Wyoming doesn't have an SAC, it's administered out of Denver. But Boulder has one all by itself.
Like,
As well, commies.
Not quite, but you're
that's in
close.
addition to the one that's assigned to Colorado. Oh.
Yeah, but their jurisdiction is counterintelligence because of the nuclear industry, Teller, Oppenheimer, all of this stuff. So it was no accident even that they put, they chose Boulder for a lot of these educational things. And Boulder is where these scientists went for recreation R&R, because there was only the road in from Golden and the road in from Lyons, and it was easy to watch what was going on. And since there wasn't any bars, they only had two to watch, the Harvest House and the Lamppost. They pretty much knew where everybody was. And, you know, that's an interesting story there. The Navy ROTC program here is the only ROTC program in the United States that has no body of water near it. Did you know that?
I did not.
Okay, that's because ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, has a big thing at Buckley, where all the little globe things are, a big building. And Office of Naval Intelligence, all of their agents come from the University of Colorado and were trained here. And they used to run the language school here, but it got too obvious, so they moved that to Monterey. And so, you know, we're on ground zero here. And well, I think the other thing is they figure not too many people have that much longevity. So we don't have the institutional memory that a lot of places do.
Right.
But it's a fascinating place when you get into
Yeah.
what's going on here. Which leads me into tonight's topic about organized crime. You don't get the transition?
No, I'm sorry.
What?
Sorry, no, sorry. Sorry.
Well, you can be excused if you don't want to understand. I think you're being deliberately obtuse.
And we are.
Yeah. So, I was thinking about this the other day. The first criminology graduate seminar I took was just when the concept of white collar crime was breaking up. Sutherland came out with this concept, and I took this 600 level course, whatever it was, and we spent the whole semester trying to define what a crime is, because you can't take statistics and have statistics measure crime if you don't know what the hell it is. So that's what the thing was about. And that year, right after that, a few interesting things happened. And one was they had the Appalachian Conference earlier, where all the mafia people had their big gathering in upstate New York. And the big news outside of the McCarthy commie hearings to see who was communist was the filing of charges against Westinghouse, General Electric, and various large electrical companies for fixing the prices on generators at Hoover Dam and places like that. So this big antitrust monopoly thing, and that was the big news items in, you know, the ordinary burglaries and robberies and stuff like that were not in the news that much because they were turning out some more sophisticated criminologists. And the techniques they use, they don't teach anymore. The only place you can get that is Rand Corporation, which is an interesting thing. So that's how I got interested in it.
Why don't they teach them anymore?
Well, they don't teach you how to make an atomic bomb anymore either.
So?
Okay, so here's a little salient fact. Everybody at Rand, you guys know what Rand Corporation is?
It's a think tank.
No, it wasn't Remington, it was a think tank. Research and development was set up by the Air Force to do, what the hell is this doing here? No. To model various things. And the interesting thing about that is that this is where Ellsberg worked when he got hold of the Pentagon Papers. And what he was able to do, well, I'll start it. He and his friends in his department were all economists. And that's what Rand was using. They were building economic models. So what I was doing here at CU in graduate school, we were doing random and biased net theory and game theory and all this kind of stuff, which chaos theory. It was statistical analysis type thing. And you can see that eventually led to Cambridge Analytica.
Cambridge Analytica?
What?
Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah, Cambridge Analytica. That was the type of stuff that was being developed here in the 60s. And then through the intelligence community, through an Office of Naval Intelligence and places like that. And well, another thing, NOAA here, the statute provides that an admiral, a two-star admiral, has to be in charge of NOAA. And they developed mathematics to detect a submarine going through the ocean with waves 10 feet high from displacement. Can you imagine that? So that's the type of stuff that went on here. We had a lot of scientists, a lot of mathematicians, and a lot of political activity going on. And Coors was funding a lot of it, and he was making nice with the missile people, so he could sell them the missile stuff, the porcelain.
I mean, that's his angle.
Yeah, well, you know. Yeah,
Yeah.
I prefer the term neo-Nazi, but that's
It's rolls off the tongue better.
So when things got a little bit hot, I left for a few years and went to Chicago, and came back, and things hadn't really changed that much. But they changed the way of disguising their activities, and brought in a bunch of hippies and long hairs and all this kind of stuff. And I'm still not convinced that was a spontaneous thing, because a lot of my clients had lots of contacts with the intelligence community. Yeah. One of my clients was one of the biggest smugglers in the world, and he was next door neighbor to Gordon Liddy in New York. And he used to smuggle ergotamine tartrate into the country to a guy named Owsley, who used to make LSD. And he had a little corporation that I formed here called Sunshine Incorporated. And they used to make things called Orange Wedgies and Purple Barrel. And
Didn't they have there was a documentary recently, Sunshine Maker, or something it's called.
Did you want,
Well, I-
They had a place
did you
down
want
by
your
the
little
Denver
outline at
Zoo,
all?
no, not yet.
a lab.
So
I think they do.
it's been a fascinating place here. And I got into the organized crime thing fairly early. And that was probably by being a rebel or whatever. There was this one lawyer named Francis Salazar, who was a competitor of mine, sort of, at least. I thought he was. He never thought he was. But, he got this building.
Did you have silver? Okay.
He got this building on Evans Avenue in Denver, and that was called the Family Dog.
Oh, yeah.
And the Family Dog used to bring in concerts. And the promoter of Family Dog was harassed by a narcotics cop. Shit, I just forgot his name. I had it just a minute ago.
Patrick Preston?
Huh?
Not Patrick.
No,
Chet
no.
Helton was a producer.
So anyway, they hired Salazar to get Detective Gray was his name, to get an injunction against the detectives for raiding the Family Dog. So Salazar took a mortgage on the building to secure his fee, went to court, lost the case, foreclosed on the building, and that became Salazar's law office.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, that's what's going on in Denver, and things were happening in Denver and also in Boulder. Now, right in 1960 or 61, Life magazine had an article about organized crime and how disguised it was in Colorado, and they described a organized crime figure that owned a trucking company here, and nobody knew who he was, and the other thing that they said was the Colorado banking industry was real active with organized crime, because it was the only place between Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Las Vegas where they could wash their money. And it's been a traditional hangout anyway. So you go to Trinidad, Colorado, for instance, which was settled by a lot of Italians, and underneath all of the streets in downtown Trinidad are tunnels. And Colorado became a safe place for the mafia to hide out and cool off before Vegas did. So they'd send them to Trinidad, and if the cops would come looking, they'd hide them in the tunnels. And there was another place outside of Fort Collins over a range of mountains called North Park. And North Park was very difficult to get to, and robbers, and it was close to the Union Pacific Railroad, so it's just a few hours horseback, and you could rob the train, and then you could run back to Colorado. So if a Wyoming posse was chasing them, they would run into Colorado, and if a Colorado posse came in, which had to come from Fort Collins, and they'd go clear down over Bertha Pass and Cottonwood and all that kind of stuff, then they would go into Wyoming, Saratoga or somewhere like that, and hide out. So that got to be a hideout for criminals too. They wrote a book about it. A guy that had a ranch there, the J&B Ranch, called the Virginian, and made it into a movie and everything. But that's what that was about. And that was kind of the background here. So one day, this guy gets arrested, and it was in where the hell was it? Littleton. We'll call him Jay. And he couldn't get a lawyer and was aroused. And the guy with him said, well, what about that guy Salazar was bitching about? What was his name? And so he said, well, let's think of it. It can't be that bad if Salazar didn't like him. And so he called me. And I was aroused. This guy had been arrested 87 times by the time I'm done with him, and never convicted.
Pretty good record.
Yeah, he was a professional gambler. What they would do is run around, get in games, and then when people, the pigeons or suckers, whatever you call them, figured out that they'd been had, they'd call the police and try to get them before they got out of town. And then they'd get arrested, and there wasn't anything they could really prosecute them for, so they just shake them down and let them go on. And through that guy, I got into a lot of other nefarious type people. And what I did is I told him at the time I wanted to be a criminologist, and I didn't really want to practice law, and I was going to go back to criminology as soon as I could. But all the grants got canceled because of Vietnam. And I said, I'll do these things as long as I don't jeopardize my license. You don't ask me to. And you let me study you and write about you. And they said, that's fine as long as you write the truth. Nobody else has. So I picked up a client that at that time was called the Italian American Civil Rights League. And it was started by Joe Colombo out of New York. And so now we'll get to, where the hell are my notes?
It's right underneath your computer.
Why the hell, who put them there? God, what dumbass did that? Okay, so we're gonna start here.
Don't forget about your aunt.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but this. Oh, that's right, I couldn't get it to print. So we'll do it this way. On 38th and Navajo is a restaurant. It's called Gaetano's.
Gaetano, yeah.
And it's now owned by some of the mayor's people. But back then it was owned by a guy named Smoldo.
Yeah.
And when the mayor took it over, he decided to take advantage of some of the old publicity. So you go into the bathroom nowadays, and here's a picture of what's on the wall there. There's 3 pictures there. And those are my clients.
Good picture of that?
Wow.
So this is the American Italian,
No,
what was it called?
Carchi Bob, Southern Colorado.
that was the labels that the police gave them.
There was a
So here's how that came about.
Family members.
A lot of clients.
There's a lot.
You notice they're all Italian. So now I'm going to go off script for a few minutes back in the 60s, one of my first clients was a woman named Gelia Tannenbaum. And she was very notorious, made a lot of publicity, a lot of headlines here, claiming to be various things, like a cryptographer for the Air Force and spy against Russia and a spy for Russia. And a lot of stuff that she did here didn't make a lot of sense, but then this is Boulder. And she had this alleged boyfriend named Thomas Ria. So Thomas Ria in 1968 disappeared under mysterious circumstances. And he was a client of mine also. And he was the leading expert on the Soviet bloc with the Iron Curtain cut off. His family were from Czechoslovakia. His grandfather was the only elected head of state of Czechoslovakia. And his parents got divorced, and his mother married a Marshall Plan administrator. And then he went to school in Berkeley, and his stepfather took a swan dive off a bridge there. And then he went from there to Harvard, where he studied under a guy named Henry Kissinger. Now, he had a cousin that came over about the same time he did, whose name was Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Brzezinski's daughter is a TV personality.
Oh, really? Well, it's curious to have somebody here that was related to one of the national security advisors under Nixon and another one under Carter. In any event, Ria disappears. Nobody knew what her was. You know somebody there?
Is that wall chart you brought?
Mhm.
Oh, I think brought it.
No, that's okay. I didn't want to
That
take
would
it.
be nice to brought it,
Just give that over to Warren, would you? So,
yeah, we could have brought that.
I know.
I've seen this.
You have?
I don't know, maybe not.
Well, I'll tell you how it came about now. Ria disappears, and they indict my client for causing his disappearance. And it went back and forth, and there was a time when somebody from the illegally located CIA office in Denver, which was at the Archdiocese building, joined up with an FBI agent and visited a guy named Mike McKevitt in the DA's office to tell him to cut down or not use the grand jury to investigate the Ria disappearance. And essentially said he was okay in living in Bratislava or something like that. Well, this caused a really big international incident. And to this day, I don't quite understand, but it can explain a lot of things. And that is, there is a writer named Wise who wrote 3 books, but in one of them, he wrote a chapter dedicated to Ria called Vanish. And this was the subject to a lot of congressional hearings, investigative reporters from New York Times, etc., what happened to Ria. But more importantly, J. Edgar Hoover wanted to know who the FBI agent was playing footsie with the CIA guy that went to see McKevitt. So he asked the director of the CIA for Denver, Ted Tvorovich, which they forgot to redact on one of the things they gave me, and they asked Richard Helms, who was head of the CIA, who went with the CIA guy, who was the FBI guy that went to visit the district attorney of Denver. Now, when they had the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Gary Hart sent me a lot of what they were working on because it was of interest to me. And one of the things was a letter, the correspondence between Helms and Hoover. And so when Hoover wrote Helms saying, rat off your guy, Helms wrote back saying, fuck you, in bureaucratese. And he said he went to the third party agreement and they did this, that, and the other. And he couldn't give Hoover the name of the agent. So it's really funny. Hoover wrote margin notes to his assistant, Miss Gandy, about what to do. And he says, break off liaison, no more contact with CIA, etc. That caused the breach of liaison between the CIA and the FBI, which, according to Wise and others, was the reason that Liddy and Ehrlichman and Nixon had to form the plumbers, because they didn't know what was going on. Ellsberg was ratting off Pentagon papers, and the CIA and the FBI, two largest intelligence agencies, weren't talking to each other, and all these scandals were breaking out in the newspaper. One of the things came out was the University of Colorado student body president was a CIA agent, and all kinds of fun things like that.
So this RIA, how do you spell that?
RIHA.
RIHA, and what was his first name?
Thomas.
Thomas.
And Tannenbaum was Gallia.
That's really familiar.
No, it's RHIA.
No, RIHA. So,
Are you organized crime?
well, I'm going to continue for a while and then I'll leave. So the next thing, I'm going to finish this one. So the next thing happens is, according to Wise, they farmed the plumbers, which is the precursor of Watergate.
Right.
So I guess I can say technically I toppled a presidency, but it wasn't anything intentional. And so Tannenbaum pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. I had to step out because I had a conflict of interest, obviously. Although if we had our president now, it wouldn't matter. So he got another lawyer, and Mike McKivitt prosecuted, and from the publicity of this prosecution, he got to run for Congress. Now, this was right when Nixon was just putting together his little cabal. Ehrlichman was, you had the war on drug thing, you had the omnibus crime bill, and Ehrlichman just admitted that they passed the drug laws in order to get the hippies and war protesters and minorities. That finally came out in the paper. But all that was going on, but they couldn't coordinate all this. And probably Nixon wasn't capable of coordinating it anyway. I think a lot of it was done by Mitchell. In any event, McKivitt ran for office and got elected to Congress. And Congress gave out a lot of bread that year to fight organized crime. And Denver didn't get a drop of money because McKivitt couldn't establish that they had an organized crime problem in Denver. So he took some money, the small grant they gave him, and he came up with the Organized Crime Manual, which you just saw pictures of some of the stuff in it. And what they did is they went through all the booking file of anyone with name ended in a vowel and stuck it in a book and called them Mafia. So I'm going to eat some a little bit here, and then we'll continue in a minute. If I leave something out, you can mention it.
You're on top of it.
All right. I don't want to bring up my aunt. That just confuses
So
matters.
what?
I don't want to bring up my aunt that much. Maybe I will. I don't know.
Well, I mean, how you, we're talking about organized crime, we really haven't gotten into it yet.
I'm getting there.
About.
I'm laying the
That's
groundwork.
That's how, we're-
Yeah.
not your aunt, you don't bring her up, I mean, it's a connection.
Yeah.
Well, then, you know, when, we came out here in the 70s, you know, how you met,
With his friends.
you know, what's his name?
Who?
I can't think of his name right now.
That's running away with Sure.
When Blake was born. What was that?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm getting. That's in my notes.
Yeah, so that was earlier than what you're talking about.
Hey,
That was before, Mexico.
No, it wasn't.
So this whole crime, mafia crime thing in Denver started because this guy was in a snit that he didn't get enough money.
Oh, but Small Dole's been around for a long time.
Small Dones had been around for a long time,
Yeah.
but they never killed anybody and they didn't beat anybody up,
And they were still pretty low.
and they were mild. Plus, they had protection out of Buffalo, New York, and Niagara Falls. That's a whole other thing because that goes back into the guy that started up the OSS, his law firm, and connections are internecine here. You know, the OSS cut a deal, huh?
Talking about Dulles, you started the Dulles, Dulles, the guy.
No, this was Wild Bill Donovan.
Oh, yeah.
But that was very early.
Yeah, but he was sponsored by the outfit in
Oh, yeah.
Cleveland. Oh, it's going. So, McKevitt gets this grant, and they put together this organized crime book. And I'm in the middle of a trial in,
So what year is it? What is this
I don't know,
about? What decade is it?
well, it was right before Fear and Loathing, so it would have been 68 or so.
Okay.
So, maybe it was a little later. So anyway, I'm in the middle of a trial in front of Judge Scott, and a client calls and they ask to break in on my trial because he's being arrested. Now things were a little less formal back then. So Scott called a recess, and I got put on the phone, and it was a guy named Michael Paladino who was my client, and he was the head of Italian American Civil Rights League, local guy. And they had just arrested him for purloining a public document. So we looked up the statute, and it says it's unlawful for a public official who gets paid by a public payroll to steal any public document. So first off, there was no way you could imagine Paladino as being a public official. I mean, he was racketeering conviction and all this kind of stuff. Secondly, the document that he allegedly stole was the organized crime manual, because what they did when Kevin came back, he issued a number each one of these things, and they issued each one out to a cop. So they wanted to subpoena the manual and get the manual so they could determine what cop had given it to the league. And so they're at his place with a search warrant, and they want to arrest him. And I go down there, and we have a hearing of about 2 weeks later, preliminary hearing. And I got a copy of the manual. I'm looking through it. And the detective that was on the raid, his name was Molnix. And Molnix was on the witness stand. And Molnix is testifying about how secretive this classified document is. And I'm asking him what statute gave him any permission or any reason to classify something like that. And he made something up, of course. And so I said, well, we're going to do something. Here's a demonstration. Take out your copy of the manual, and I'll take out mine. I'm going to read a paragraph and you read a paragraph. So we did this for a while, and the judge says, why are you doing this? What's the purpose of this? And I said, well, I'm trying to establish a crime. And he said, I thought your client was trying to establish that he didn't commit it. I said, that's true. The crime here is plagiarism committed by the Denver Police Department, because everything I've read here is from Sutherland's third edition of criminology, lifted word for word right out of the goddamn textbook. And I showed it to him, and I showed my textbook. That was kind of funny. But Mullick's got even with me later with another client named Ciccarelli when he arrested him. And that made the headlines of the news. We were having a preliminary hearing, and all of a sudden, Mullick stopped the preliminary hearing and said, Your Honor, Mr. Blue's client just threatened my life. I'm sitting there, Collins is sitting there, what the hell's going on? I said, how'd he do that? Well, he went like this and put his middle finger up and bit the knuckle of his first finger. And the judge said, well, we all understand what the middle finger means. Well, what's this about biting the first knuckle? I asked, so what does that mean? He says, that's a sign that the mafia uses as a death threat. And I said, no shit, really? I said, how did you find this out, Alex? Here's his classic answer. I read it in the Bellacci papers. That's almost better than Sutherland. So, using that book, Denver Police Department started applying for grants to fight organized crime. Now here's the kicker of the organized crime manual. I'm cross-examining them. Actually, I had the DA on the stand, or the congressman, whatever, and we were talking about the books and how he's using them. And I said, well, how many do you have printed? He said 20,000. I said, well, you just said there's only 10,000 numbered. What happened to the other 10,000? And he'd earlier testified that they only had 10,000, they were all numbered and everything like that. And he said, well, I left him with some lobbyists in Denver to pass them out to congressmen and bureaucrats so we could get funding. So that's how they established the organized crime thing with the Denver Crime Manual, which was done on this $100,000 grant because they had Mrs. Tannenbaum and Rhea take down the FBI and CIA.
Completely ridiculous.
Okay, now do I want to talk about the shooting do I want to talk about the shooting or Jess?
About what?
The shooting, the Smaldone shooting in the creamery or Jess?
Well, I don't care. Both.
Okay, so this is how they treat organized crime. Several years ago, I get my group of Italian-American protesters, and the cops had always wanted to go after them. And there was a burglary at Flack's warehouse. And Flack's was owned by what at that time they called the Jewish Syndicate, which worked closely with the Italians. And what they did is they decided every year Flack's had a burglary right about the time of inventory. And then they filed an insurance claim.
It's great. It's so convenient.
Now, one year, they hired Ciccarelli and Paulino and all the guys to go in and punch a hole in the warehouse. And they're sitting around, they're saying, well, we got the hole here, let's not go away empty-handed. So they grabbed a few things of shaving lotion and razor blades and, bullshit stuff and take it to this Italian guy that had a grocery store and sold it to him. And when the burglary happened, they were looking around for anything stolen that might have come from there. But they got an informer, and he was ducking a subpoena, and Mullick's got to him and explained life from the third tier if he's in that protection up there. And he said, you're going to testify for us or somebody's going to bounce you off the third tier down to sea level. So he decided he better take immunity. Well, they went through this whole trial, an organized crime trial against the Italian American guys, in order to cover up a bigger bankruptcy fraud and insurance fraud from the guys that own the warehouse. And that's how it got into it. Now, at that time, during the trial, we're in chambers, and we discovered a bug under the judge's desk, planted there by either FBI or organized crime group. And we had 6 weeks of trial, 6 days of trial. And at the end, we had some alternative jurors. So one of the alternatives came up and said, can we ask you some questions? I said, sure. And she said, well, which of one of you guys was representing the Godfather? Because that's how they were portraying this bumbling burglar as, the Godfather and his group. Put Joey Gallo to shame. So I said, which one do you think? And she said, well, I think it's your client. He had gray hair, very distinguished looking, and you talked the most. And I said, well, maybe. So I said, would you mind? I said, why are you asking this? Well, that's what we talked about every time we had a recess. Now, for 6 days, every time there was a recess, these jurors were told not to discuss the case. And they were discussing it every recess, betting on who was in charge and things like that. And what effect did bouncing somebody off the cement from the third tier have? And so I said to the judge, or to the juror, I said, would you mind telling this to the judge? Now, at that time, we already knew that the bug was in there in the judge's chamber. So she goes in and talks about the discussion. Well, the judge had no choice but to call a mistrial. And the organized crime unit, the attorney general, called us liars. And I said, play your own tape that you illegally taped in chambers and to confirm it. So they didn't really do much about that. And so they had to cut another deal with the defendants.
Ice cream parlor.
Huh?
You talk about the ice cream parlor.
Well, we'll get to that. Oh, I guess I might as well go there. So these guys were locally known as the Keystone something that rhymed with cops. And they lived up to their reputation. In fact, in the 70s, when I was officing in Denver, I ran into Jimmy Breslin, who at that time, people would mistake me for him. And I was talking to him, and I said, when you wrote that book, The Gang You Couldn't Shoot Straight, I said, did you use my clients as a model? And he said, no, they're all like that. Walking, they chase a guy down the street, and they stop at a water bottle because they don't want to get their alligator shoes wet. One guy went around with a lion to collect. And
the Nargo Marco.
oh, and I want to talk about that one.
Well, but that's the same thing.
Yeah, well, I can talk
That's
about
even funnier.
I can talk about Joe dangling somebody out of the
Yeah.
10th floor of a building in Phoenix to get him to play.
Yeah, but
Pay.
the Marco Market is kind of funny.
Okay.
It goes with the way it's on.
All right, so these guys, essentially what they were was they were gamblers and bookmakers and things like that. They were pretty well harmless, but they'd scam every once in a while. And the real criminals were like the stockbrokers and
Some things never change.
the bankers, and I remember.
And the stock market.
Oh yeah,
God, what was that
What's his
blinder?
name? Blinder
Well,
Robinson?
I was involved in
Said
that
he never
one.
met a criminal until he met them in the cocaine era.
Yeah. So anyway,
I digress.
one of the guys that testified against my clients was a guy named Joey Nucci. Nucci was a 28-year-old aspiring godfather. And here's how that case came about. Nucci borrowed a big diamond from Checker Smoldo. And then they had a paste diamond that looked the same. And they would go into a jewelry store and they'd do diamond switches looking at some of the diamonds. And since they had the big real one to look at, the salesperson figured, well, these people are legitimate. And they had this whole bag full of switcheroos and they would switch. So they get Nucci had the diamond and Smoldo asked for it back. And Nucci told him to engage in self-copulation and wouldn't give it to him. Well, a few days later, they decided to have a parlay at an ice cream parlor that on 38th Street that Baldino owned, called Darlene's Ice Cream Parlor. One of my clients got this pistol and loaned it to Nucci, but it was a rimfire pistol, and Nucci bought centerfire ammunition or vice versa. And there is Smoldo and then Joe the Ram Salardino from Pueblo and Tony Ciccarelli, Michael Baldino, Silver Fox. And they're arguing about this diamond. Well, all of a sudden, Nucci pulls out this gun that my client had given him. And he says, your days are numbered here. Pulls the gun out, points it at Smoldo, and pulls the trigger. Smoldo faints. The gun doesn't go off. Meanwhile, Joe the Ram's trying to go for his. And Ciccarelli grabs, you remember the old glasses they used to give people when they had cataracts? The Coke glasses?
Yeah.
Well, that's what Salardino had. So he grabs the glasses from Salardino and does a jig on them. Glass goes all over. And finally, one of the guys gets his gun out and shoots Nucci, and it hits a button and goes around the rib cage. And everybody was sorry that there were shots exchanged and very apologetic. And they all rush Nucci to the hospital. And for some reason, one of the informers, and the cops all had all kinds of informers, there wasn't anything anybody did that they didn't know about, got word to Molnix that Nucci was in the hospital and Smoldo or one of his associates shot him. So they went to visit Nucci in the hospital and explained to him that they didn't think Smoldo liked him anymore because he had an unfriendly act of shooting him. And he said, rumor on the street is Smoldo's going to kill you. When in fact, Smoldo was kind of worried about it because everything had been quiet and he lost his temper. And besides which, it was self-defense because Nucci pulled his gun first. Just because it didn't work didn't matter. And this is why I named it the gang that couldn't shoot straight like his. So Nucci talks to him about the burglary at Flax, Colorado, which started that whole sequence of events. Now, they had a preliminary hearing on that. Oh, okay, that's good.
It's okay.
And Nucci came in to testify, and then they had another guy that came in to testify that had seen him, and he was escaping. They gave a gutter service of subpoena. That means they just threw a subpoena out and signed a little affidavit that they'd served him, and the guy had heard that he was being subpoenaed, and showed up in his lawyer's office, who was Gene Dykman, a friend of mine, and Dykman came in and got the subpoena quashed, and then the witness went over to Dykman's office, and they caught him there. I mean, the guy was as dumb as the rest of them. But it was kind of an interesting trial, and it's interesting the priorities of the police, because that's where the money was with organized crime, and that's where the headlines were. And I couldn't really complain about that. I was in the headlines as much as anyone else. But it was kind of fun. It really was fun.
Well, what happened to the diamond?
Oh, Smallwood got it back.
Oh,
So this same group got busted out in California once. And what reminded me is something we saw on the television the other day. What program was that?
oh, it was, Ben Affleck from the Knight Rider thing, night thing. Is that
Okay,
what that
so
was?
what happens?
Sit down in Florida and give them,
They make some arrests, and they discover a stack of a bunch of $100 bills in the wall, and they make another raid, and they got a bunch of $1 bills in the wall. And of course, the hero on that put it together that it was a counterfeiting thing.
oh, that was NCIS.
NCIS, okay. So these were called the Money Machine. I'll get that. By my guys. And the way it worked, you got a pigeon. And you showed them how this money machine would turn $1 bills into $100 bills. And you crank them out and you give them about $1,000 and tell them to go out and get as many ones or tens or 20s as they can. And so we need, at the very least, you need 100,000 to make this worthwhile. We'll make you a millionaire. So this is in Hollywood, and Hollywood is built on hills. So they go into this guy's house, the pigeon, and they said they needed a dark room to make this work. They go into the bathroom, and what they would generally do is bolt out the back window and leave them with the wet ones. Well, the FBI had been watching these guys, and they raided the place to arrest them at that time for running the scam. So they hear the cops at the front door and decided to bail out the back window. However, the house faced uphill. It was built in Hollywood Hills, and there was a 2.5 floor drop behind the window. So one of them standing there, and he won't go. Next one comes up behind him and pushes him out there and dives in on top of him. And the third one dives out, and one of them broke both his legs. So they decided to hide him out in a garbage place until they could come back and get him. So their buddy with the 2 broken legs was sitting there, and the cops finally rounded him up, including the guy out of the garbage bin, and took him immediately back to Denver. And I guess the passengers on the plane were really complaining about the smell of the guy. So that's one of the things that had happened. I mean, these guys were really entertaining. Actually, I sort of enjoyed it. And
Whatever happened to whatever mafia presidents existed in Denver? Did it die with the small nose, or did it?
no, they're still kind of around.
Yeah. Is it superseded by drug gangs and other crap?
Well, that's a whole topic there. What's happened between, the ethnocentric crime in Denver. Any city is about the same. You got the blacks moving in, the Chicanos moving in, the Salvadorans.
but we're talking about that small Jones group, and that group just kind of fizzled out. That's what, the organized crime, huh?
Well, what happened is,
Well, like Briola and the, yeah.
okay. Well, Joe was another one.
Remember when we went out for dinner, or when he had us at that house?
Yeah. So we're out to dinner with this one guy, and he was a really good chef.
It
And
was at a house.
yeah, Arlene and I were the only ones there that hadn't been in Leavenworth or some similar institution. So Arlene goes up to him and says, "Wow, this food is really good. Where'd you learn to cook?" He said, "Leavenworth." Arlene got embarrassed. So anyway, one of the cases he got charged with was theft and interstate transportation of stolen securities. And he bought them from a burglar and was going to fence him for a game because he was a professional gambler, backgammon actually. And the whole problem there was they were 3 Mile Island stock that were worthless after the thing went up, so they couldn't prove value.
Just piece of paper.
I mean, this is these guys' luck. Paulino bought a food truck once, and he was not making any money, and it was too much work. So they decided to drive it up Loveland Pass and let it roll off accidentally off the mountain. They forgot to put it in gear and blocked the wheel behind when they took off the first wheel to make it look like an accident, and it rolled down. But the worst thing is they forgot to pay their insurance premium. So I've had more of a cavalier attitude toward organized crime than I think most people. And what happened to Smalldones? We got gambling in Colorado, and that's where Smalldones mostly were.
Right.
They really were bookmakers.
Bookmakers, yeah. So I was.
I have to tell you real quickly about Goodwill. When we adopted a little boy, like, and this is in '69, and then well, I have a client, we're going to the Greenbrier in Boulder. You know the Greenbrier? So I get all dressed up and things. We're taking, like in this little carriage type thing we carry because he's only a couple months old. And in walks this guy. what was his name again? No, what were you talking about?
Jess.
Oh, Jess Goodwin. No, yeah, Goodwin. And he and his wife is there. In walks this guy. It's like something out of a movie. With this cigar, what you doing, Dennis? This guy from a Scarface and things like oh my God, the Greenbrier. Yeah, I know, it was so wild. Somebody went there like, I mean, his wife was kind of, more like me, a little middle class looking. But I mean, I thought, oh my God, it's like straight out of something with, movies. It was
Central casting.
Oh, it really was, because they played that, that role.
So who was this guy?
He was a very big guy in Denver. This is '69.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think he was on that chart because that was earlier.
Yeah. He was.
Remember, he was in the hospital and they almost electrocuted him.
Oh God.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah.
So we'll digress. I was going to tell something else, but we can talk about that crap game. But anyway, we'll talk about the hospital thing. One of the guys I practiced with was a guy named Charles Vigil. And Charles was the U.S. attorney under Roosevelt and Truman.
What was his last name?
Vigil.
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 It says, or familiar.
And he was the first U.S. attorney in this jurisdiction to actually indict and convict Chauncey and Checker Smalldones. And it was really funny because my clients used to have to go past his office to get to my office. And they'd kind of tiptoe across or whatever. It was kind of humorous to watch that. But anyway, Briola got caught in San Diego. His first one was for bookmaking, and then he went to jail on that. And then he went on to jail on the second one. And what they had done is somebody had intercepted a shipment of stolen securities or ones to be shredded, and they were going to put it into one of their friends' banks in the Bahamas and get a loan and use the loan to buy La Costa Country Club. So one of their informers found out about it, and they decided to follow these guys and catch them in the act of buying La Costa. That sort of got prematurely stopped by an arrest, and I'm personally convinced that it was stopped because there was a tie-in with the bank with Nixon and things like that, but I'll never know. Anyway, they got a tape of him driving down, I think, Coronado Boulevard or something like that, throwing these securities out the window with the cops chasing him. So they convicted him of securities fraud. Before the 3 Mile Island. So he goes to the slammer out of conviction out of San Diego. Well, about a year and a half later, I get this call from him, and he'd been released on parole. He said, I got this letter from Bureau of Prisons saying I owed him 6 months. Would I please come back and do another 6 months? What'll I do? So I'll take care of it. So I spend the weekend trying to get an injunction against the Bureau of Prisons, and we're in front of a friendly judge that I've known for a while. And so I told Briola that I knew the judge and he was friendly. And I go in there, and this judge just reams me a new one. He says, why do you think you can enjoin the Bureau of Prisons? How do you think you can do this? How do you think you can do that? And I said, Judge, you got the case Saturday. I haven't had a chance to research it, but it just doesn't seem fair. He says, well, Mr. Blewett, there's a library right upstairs. We're going to go to lunch, and you can stay here and find some law that substantiates your position. So Briola's pulling on my coat. He says, I thought you said this judge was a friend of yours. I said, yeah. Man, he's got a hell of a way of showing it. So, come back for lunch, and Judge Winter says, well, Mr. Blewett, what'd you find out? And I said, well, I need more time to research. He said, I'm going to save you some time. You can't do it. But, and I said, well, I still want to put on a hearing. I got all these witnesses here, and I told him sort of what it was, so he let me do that. And while he's there, he's going through the sentencing commitment of Judge Turrentine out of San Diego. And he said, well, I'm sitting here looking at this order for incarceration, order for commitment, and I see that there's a comma left out, and it's ambiguous. Now, I know Judge Turrentine very well, and I know he would not like something like this to go out of his office with any typographical mistakes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this back to Judge Turrentine to correct the sentence. And while he's at sentencing, I'm sure he'll take that 6 months off the sentence too. And right before I started the hearing, the judge looked, and this is a famous quote of his, it's even on some walls in the courthouse. He looks at the U.S. attorney and he says, well, this is a chicken shit case. And because they were trying to put it back in, he'd been out 3 years successfully on parole. So anyway, the prosecutor asked that they arrest him and deny him a bond because it's an appeal and he's a dangerous criminal. The judge looks at the prosecutor, who was an asshole anyway, and he says, Mr. Mackey, what part of chicken shit don't you know? So, you know, they call that the chicken shit case. And then so that's where you want to go. You want to go to the crab game?
Oh, and is that the, which one is that? Is that the one at the Marble Marble?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I was able to do is because I was also studying them, they told me a lot of things that they probably shouldn't have. I got, for instance, the connections between the intelligence community and organized crime. They told me about all that. Jess and his buddy used to work for Jack Ruby, who was the guy that shot Oswald, who shot Kennedy. And Ruby at that,
That's just the
Yeah.
one we were talking about.
and that was at a time when what he and his partner were doing is they were smuggling guns into Cuba. And they were supplying both Castro and Batista. And they said it was good business. And the way they were paying for it is the CIA was giving them heroin to run back, and they put them in armored cars in money bags and then take them across the border and give it to Ruby.
No, that wasn't, that.
Yeah, that was.
Goodwill?
Mhm.
Well, I don't think it was.
So that's where I first discovered about the CIA connection and things like that. And I was able to sort of watch the division between, you could draw a line in the Mason-Dixon line, and the northern organized crime were entirely different than the southern ones. The northerners pretty much were into bribery and gambling and things like that, and the southern ones were more into drugs and smuggling. And that was, the southern ones were run with Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, also with an alliance of some sort I never figured out between them and Giancano in Chicago. So it's even hard now to sociogram some of this, but it's pretty well tied all together, and some of my friends have made some charts of this.
Do you think maybe the southern branch could more easily engage in drug trafficking because they had a seashore all the way
Yeah, they have access.
Oh, that was part of it.
Maine to Florida?
They have the
But
access.
see, Marcello wasn't an Italian, he was a Moroccan that he immigrated there. And what he did, and the way he got his power, is he controlled the fruit docks in New Orleans, and the intelligence community needed his information to overthrow governments down in Central America. So he kind of made a deal with them. You know, I'll help you overthrow your government and put in your banana republic, and you let me do a few things here. So, you know, just like Office of Naval Intelligence made a deal with, they indicate with the criminals to guard the docks in New York during the World War II area, and that's why they let Lucky Luciano out of jail. And then they helped him invade Sicily, made Patton into a big hero.
You want
And
another one?
Okay,
One.
thank you.
Move it over.
Yeah, I'll just take it.
so, what did I start on? I started on, got distracted.
Crap.
Okay, so we're at this crap game. Well, first off, I get this call from Jess one night. And he had to go by, you know, after a while he was on crutches and he had a few heart attacks. And he was, these guys are old by, you know. They're old when I first met him. Jess was a B-50 or B-25 pilot during World War II. He was Gene Autry's cousin, and after the war he went out and bought a casino and lost it, and then moved back to Colorado. He's a real colorful character, though. And maybe I should digress. No, I won't do that. Yeah. Oklahoma City. Oh, one funny thing happened when I was with Jess. We went down to Phoenix together, or Scottsdale, and we're in the Thunderbird Inn or whatever it was, and all of a sudden I hear this scratching on the door. So I go to the door, and here's Jess on the floor grabbing his chest. I said, "What's the matter?" He says, "You got any nitroglycerin?" And I said, "What happened?" He says, "I'm having a heart attack." And I said, "Well, how'd that happen?" He says, "I got off the elevator, and here's these two naked ladies walking out of their hotel room going somewhere to the sauna or something, and their towels fell down." He said, I started getting angina. So always a few tales now and then. Well, after that, he had a few more arrests. One was he got indicted on a big multi-state gaming thing in Oklahoma with a bunch of city services and Phillips Oil and Texaco people. What they were doing is the Italians, now Bridwell wasn't an Italian type, he was the opposition. So the Italians, gambling is a big thing. And every once in a while, they'd have to get healthy if they lost too much. So they'd fix 2 games a year. And they bribe the referees and things like that. So let's say Cincinnati's playing Cleveland, and there's a big spread, and you got maybe 50 million on Cincinnati and 3 million on Cleveland. All of a sudden, Cleveland gets lucky that game. And so do the bookmakers. And it was seldom enough. There's always undertow of rumors there, but nobody really could prove it. Until they indict these guys, and some real important people out of Oklahoma City and Tulsa, Pody Poe and a few people like that, real rich oil people, because that's what they were doing is they'd find out what games the fix were in, and then they would go and they'd bet $20-30 million on the ones that they knew were going to win, and that screwed up their little fixing organization. So I spent a while in Tulsa trying the case, and my client was telling me what was going on there, and I at first didn't believe him. So I went down there for about a week and listened to the tapes, and he explained the code to me that they were using, and sure enough, that's what was going on. All of a sudden, when I asked for subpoenas to prove that, the U.S. attorney came to me and he said, "I understand your client has got heart problems, and we want to have a mistrial with 18 defendants. So we'll give your client a misdemeanor and guarantee 6 months in the hospital in Houston if he shuts up." I said, "Far out." So that's what happened to my client. So right after that, we're drinking in this bar in Denver. And was in Jefferson County, right over the line. And all of a sudden, well, we break up and I go home. He goes home. I get this phone call. And he's the next morning, and he says, "You got to get down here." And I says, "Why?" He says, "They're trying to kill me. They're trying to kill me." I said, "Where are you?" "Well, he's in the Denver General Hospital confinement wing where they put all the prisoners." So what happened, he was sitting in the parking lot getting ready to drive, and he had angina. So this Lakewood police guy came up to him, and said, "Oh, we got you now, Bridwell. You're under arrest for drunk driving." And he's trying to tell him he's having a heart attack. He said, "We don't believe that." So they haul him off to Jefferson County Jail. The jailer, he's been in there often enough that the jailers know who it is. And the jail captain said to the Lakewood Cop, he says, "He's having a heart attack. I don't want him dying here. Take him to the one on Colfax."
Denver General.
No, before that.
Oh,
In-
St. Anthony?
Yeah, St. Anthony's West. So they take him there, and by then he's looking real bad. St. Anthony's, and he's in custody, of course. St. Anthony said, "We don't want him dying here. Take him to Denver General." So by the time they get him to Denver General, his ticker stopped. So they had to revive him. Now this is where it gets funny. You got somebody without a working heart laying on a gurney in an emergency room. Got a bunch of interns around, emergency room people, and they decide they're going to use the paddles on him. Well, the intern kneels on the gurney, they hit him with the paddle, and Bridwell was still cuffed to the bed. It woke the intern up pretty much. Then he didn't start him that time, and now the intern or the whatever resident or somebody is having an argument with the police department or the sheriff's office about unlocking the handcuffs. And they said, "Well, he's an escape risk, and our regulations say we got to have him handcuffed."
Not right this moment.
The doctor said, "He ain't going anywhere the way he is." So they get him started. I still laugh about this one. So what they did next is they got a lock ward. They take him up there, and they have a shift change, and the new guard notices no handcuffs. So what he does is he goes and handcuffs him to the bed, which shorted out one of those monitor systems. So when they got done with that, he finally gets out, and it wasn't a crime to have a heart attack, even though it was him. But they decided, they sent him a bill for like $60,000 or $70,000 for the monitor, an emergency care room. When they tried to kill him, it was kind of rubbing salt in the wound there.
Wow.
Did he pay it?
No.
What about the coin?
Well, Coin will have to do that another story.
Okay.
Dennis, we're gonna